Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the afterlife journey of the soul. With me is Dr. Joseph Gallenberger, who is a clinical psychologist. He is the author of several books, including Brothers Forever, a book about the death and suicide death of his older brother. He's also written Liquid Luck, Inner Vegas, and most recently, Heaven is for Healing, a book taking another exploration or investigation into the meaning of his brother's death after more than 25 years. He is, in addition, a senior instructor with the Monroe Institute of Virginia. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Jeff. How are you today?
Good, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Since you work with the Monroe Institute and have for many years, they have some very unusual programs, almost shamanistic in nature, or maybe a good word would be archaeotechnico, and that they combine shamanistic techniques with modern scientific approaches for looking at the afterlife.
Yes, they do. They have a program called Lifeline, and in there, folks go into very high meditative states using their brainwave technology to allow people to meditate very rapidly and deeply, even without years of experience. And within that meditative state, begin to contact the other side of the veil, if you will, and to establish communication, not only with loved ones that a person might know, but also souls that could use assistance that the person's never met, that might be from 100 years ago. And then we've had folks verify that the information obtained was indeed accurate to that individual that may have lived many, many years ago. And then they go into further programs to explore some of the afterlife states, if you will, not just immediately upon death.
So I have to assume that based on your personal experiences with this approach, plus as we will discuss and as we have discussed in an earlier interview, your experience with gifted intuitive channelers, you don't have any doubt about the existence of an afterlife.
I do not. To me, that's a known.
Okay. And I'll say for myself, so our viewers know, as a parapsychologist, I find the evidence very, very impressive for the existence of an afterlife, but I do harbor some doubts. I can't say that I'm 100% convinced. I'm probably only about 98.5% convinced of that.
Pretty far along, yes.
Yeah. But in your case, because of your brother's suicide, you felt a need to be in communication with him, to understand what his afterlife process would be.
Yes. Initially, after his death, it was mostly, is he okay? He did leave notes, but they were kind of practical notes. People want to know that that person loved them. Most afterlife communication, suicide or not, often is the first message conveyed is, I am totally fine and I love you. I can remember one at Monroe. A fellow was looking for his wife, and he wasn't having much success. And I said, well, if you want, I'll give it a try. And in the shower the next day, I got an impression that she was there, red and white checkered tablecloth, page 238 of this particular book. And then the message, I love him so much, I am fine. Let him know that. So I conveyed that. It turned out they picnicked every Sunday with the red and white checkered tablecloth, and that page was their favorite poem that they read together. And I had no way, of course, of knowing that. So she was kind enough to give me good verifiable things for him.
Yeah.
And then once he knew she was okay, then he was able to establish contact. Any slight fear that what if I found this person and I couldn't help them or they weren't okay gets in the way of the quite delicate meditative states one needs to have, which are, very open-hearted, very calm, very trusting. And so the programs at the Institute, Lifeline, particularly on this, are quite valuable with that and the skills that they
Well, I
teach.
gather that a lot of that Lifeline work involves what some shamans would call soul rescue.
Yes.
You're
that would be
finding
the term.
people who have perhaps lost their way on the other side and are in need of guidance.
Yes. Jeff, with my first book, Brothers Forever, I looked at how many people die on the planet a year, and it's quite a few. It's like millions and millions.
Yeah.
And if even 1% had some difficulty, there may be some people there that would need some assistance. It can be, after sudden death, not realizing you've dropped a body because there's not that much change psychologically, strange as that may sound. And then it can be things like, I know there was one person found kind of a lump of energy, kept attracting their attention, so they breathed lots of more energy into it, and it turned into their father, who had died many years before. And the woman said, "Dad, haven't you seen angels and guides?" And he said, "Yeah, but I'm hiding." "Why?" "I don't want to go to judgment." So strong belief in an afterlife that involves heavy judgment, for example, might keep a soul personality on the lam, hiding out from the very guides that are trying to help them settle in.
Now, guides, that's an interesting word that comes up over and over again when we refer to afterlife experiences, and yet you run into people who maybe they have guides, but they're not accessible.
They are not perceivable to that person, sure. Yes. And it seems like one of the reasons with the soul rescue work works is we still have an earth radiation. We can tolerate negative emotions more easily. If somebody died and they want to get even with the person that murdered them, and that we can get their attention over there perhaps easier than more wispy spirits can at times.
I see.
But if you think even on this planet, if you have a relative, say, addicted to heroin, people are screaming at them, pay attention, look at what's happening in your life, you're going down the wrong path, and they just can't hear it. So you have to be open to the hearing, and fear or loops of thought, belief, can keep you inaccessible for a while.
Well, if incarnation here on the earth plane is a process of spiritual growth or of psychological growth, and certainly minimally physical growth,
Yes.
That process of learning and growing continues.
Yes, it seems, best I can tell, after my brother's death, again, we had some immediate contact. Now, 20 years later, I wondered, the event of his suicide shifted my life dramatically. It became my life's work to figure out how could a good man, hardworking and such, still not achieve success. And so I've done a lot of work in the abundance field. That's where Inner Vegas and Liquid Luck come in.
Yeah.
And so I knew it affected me for the last 20 years, a big journey. I wondered what had happened to him. And so I began contact with the initial channeler, Pam Hogan, that I had worked with before. And she thought, this might be an interesting project. So we had several sessions scheduled where we connected with Pete and her own guides to say what happens after death, particularly with suicide, but it applies to other events as well.
Yeah.
And got, I think, some very interesting information.
Mm-hmm.
The first session, I couldn't sit still. I was pacing, chills, crying, the amount of compassion from the other side that was just pouring, and this is a telephone interview.
Yeah. No, but this is relatively close to his actual death.
No, this is
20 years later.
This is 20 years later, a few
Okay.
months ago.
All right, so you're still filled with emotion.
Well, the compassion that was conveyed that with everybody met on the other side, regardless, all death leads to light, was their message. Regardless of what kind of jerk you were, whatever it might be from the earth perspective, you're met with tremendous healing and tremendous compassion. And that was even conveyed over the phone lines to me when I was listening to this channeling.
Yeah.
She was weeping as well.
Oh.
And they talk about a fairly organized process in suicide, 2 or 3 main ways that people are met. On the range of, I only had a few days to go, but I didn't want to go through the cancer pain, and I left early, which may take an hour to dust yourself off, if you will, in earth time ideas, to murder-suicide, and how souls are helped with the level of darkness they have. And so I found that very fascinating, that they talked about 3 main ways we try to help folks with that kind of transition. I assume that's true for other traumatic types of death, drug overdose, accidents, but one of the huge things was the amount of compassion, the no judgment. There did seem to be this life review that is often talked about in the near-death experience literature. But in the case of suicide or that type of trauma, often they talked about putting the person almost into a coma-like state, so they had very little consciousness, and beginning to psychically work with them to heal wounds before waking them up. At that point, they might be in a kind of a movie theater setting, review their life, and then review what if they had stayed. But without judgment, with tremendous compassion around. And so people don't escape things by suicide, but they're not judged and thrown into hell.
Well, that's very important right there, given social attitudes that are very common across many cultures.
Yes. We have some very, very dark feelings that try to incentivize us against taking our life, including, as I mentioned last program, taking all a relative's property in many societies, saying that the soul will be in hell for eternity, those kind of things.
Well, it almost seems from your description that for a person who dies with a lot of burdened by a lot of personal problems, whether it's suicide or an addiction, or maybe a person who's just had a bad life or a criminal life, that the afterlife offers opportunities for rehabilitation.
Yes, deep healing, understanding and insight, as well as it seems like a very soothing. Their goal is for a soul, it seems, to be able to hold at least a thimbleful of light or love. So the challenge is when the person feels totally undeserving of that or are so hateful, that's where they have to work hard, I guess. Most of us, they don't have to work so hard, I think. And this process can take a while. In my brother's case, 20 years later, he seems to be just now about ready to incarnate again. And they talk about, things that took 6 months or so, and then a few years for this. And time is not relevant the way it is here or there, but it can take a bit.
I recall one of your descriptions, and I think this was early on, maybe within months or a year or two after his death, that you consulted with Pam Hogan, the channeler, and she said something to the effect that, your brother he's in a band, he's playing music, he's having a great time. And that seemed rather surprising.
Yes, he was very, very relieved to be out of the physical.
Mm-hmm.
He always had a quirky sense of humor, and, he sent messages of shooting yourself is not the way to do it because it blew his energy around. But and then he became wistful later. Not again, didn't judge himself harshly, but was saddened by the pain he was causing here in relatives, and also wistful. Knowing what I know now, I could do things differently. He was kind of eager to jump back into a physical life, and they said, hold up. Observe your brother Joe, observe other people, see how people handle the kind of things you've handled with different ways. And so he was parked on what we would call the observation plane for a while. And now, believe it or not, when we talked, it looks like people have an option of having a life that is not physical. So they could have quite a strong experience with memory, emotion, etc., but it's not as challenging as being here in the physical world, where it seems like when we enter the physical world, our family issues, tribe issues, our own issues are encoded into our very DNA. And it's a little harder to stay in contact with angelic realms, etc. So that many people who've had a very rough life will opt for a simulation life several times before feeling ready and eager and willing to come back into Earth, which had been painful to them.
Well, some of the spiritualist literature suggests that there are realms of the afterlife that are very, very similar to the physical plane, like cities.
Yes. Yeah, and it seems like some people are not aware of where they are all the time. Other people are. So when my parents passed, it seemed like this is many years after my brother, they got together consciously and relived, if that would be the word, his life from 18 to 22, which was a critical time where he was deciding not to go to college, join the army, do things different ways. And that was healing for them, because he always felt like, gee, if they'd given me money to start a business, things might have gone differently or whatever. And so that he could understand perhaps that his attitudes would have carried forward even despite circumstances. But there seems to be a lot of activity over there for learning and for healing, best I can tell.
Well, and you brought up the issue of reincarnation, which is an interesting one for me. You seem to be suggesting that reincarnation is a natural process that many people go through, but it's an option. It's not necessarily for everyone.
Best I can tell, you'd be correct. It probably is for many. As we get more able to hold a love, and other things, I think more and more options open. And so sort of toward the end, and we're using time language here, but toward the end of a reincarnation cycle that might involve hundreds of lives, a person might choose to stay on that side and be a guide or a helper for 1,000 years or whatever it might be, or to incarnate into other systems that may have learned how to work without taxation or things that might...
Well, we are so conditioned by our biological life.
Yes.
I mean, if we think of the universe as a whole, why, time extends out for billions and billions of years, and yet a human lifetime seems very long to us, even though in the larger scheme of things, it's like a blink of an eye.
Yeah, I was impressed to hear somebody use this analogy, that all of recorded human history would be like a millimeter of paint on top of the tallest skyscraper. If the skyscraper was all of time we know it has been here just on Earth. So in the 6 billion years or whatever, 4 billion, our recorded history is like the millimeter of paint on top. And on that, then within our lives, it's just like that.
Well, and yet the great mystics would tell us that we're one with everything.
Yes. Yes.
And it's often puzzling to me, how is it that we're one with everything, and yet we have all of our unique psychological processes that we go through ourselves? There's sort of a paradox
Yes,
there.
it is. Folks will talk as we move from beingness into individual. The first thing we do is adopt the illusion of being separate.
Mm-hmm.
And that can allow us then to have all this stuff we consider separate.
Mm-hmm. So the illusion of separation, you're suggesting, can continue for hundreds of lifetimes.
Yes, but there may be a greater awareness of the connection to the whole, almost like I am connected to my family,
Mm-hmm.
but I feel like I'm an I and I have a family.
Mm-hmm.
At some level of oneness, it may be that there's not much differentiation
Yeah.
there, or paradoxically, all differentiation,
Mm-hmm.
but there's not so much identification with yourself as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like you could go through many lives, but probably here feel more individual and more isolated in your own skin
Yeah.
than on the other side. You might be aware, because communication's telepathic and other things, that the boundaries are much more permeable
Mm-hmm.
than we usually consider here.
Well, I gather that you've had an opportunity now to explore through both the Monroe process and through the channeler the changes that your brother has experienced in the afterlife for now over a quarter of a century.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And I gather he's gone through various phases.
Yes.
Have you had direct communication?
Yes. Initially, as I mentioned last interview, I was too frazzled. I couldn't meditate out of a paper bag, mostly. Then there would be the signs.
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching my daughter how to play poker. She was about 6 years old. We're playing for pennies on a rug, and beautiful sunlight was streaming on this oriental rug. And dang, I swear to you, she won every single hand for like 20 minutes. And then I got real serious, and I said, honey, this isn't how poker goes. And I felt my brother's presence really strongly chuckling. He was a big poker player.
Uh-huh.
Putting on a tie for my first TV.
Mm-hmm.
He was a good dresser, and I am not famous for that.
Yeah.
And he felt like he was there helping me pick out a tie. For one of the tricks of contact would be, if a person's had the type of death he did, they don't want to take on the cloak of their own human personality they've most recently embodied, because it has pain associated with
Oh,
it.
yes.
So if you can think of them in their highest and finest, their quality of their sense of humor, of lovingness, and see them younger, if they died old, see them in really good shape, contact's more likely, because that tends to be the kind of shape they're in, and they don't want to take on too much of the old radiation patterns that they may have carried when they were here. So he, for a while, did that, you know, and so contact would be more like a undifferentiated, pulsing heart of love, but I knew it was my brother. Then as he got more comfortable, then we could banter a little more like we did in life here. So many different stages. It was ongoing over 20 years. Yeah.
Now, my mother died around 6 years ago at the age of 90, and she had a luxuriant head of hair. She very proud of her beautiful hair.
Yes.
And I had a dream about 2 years after her death, and when she came and her hair was shaven, and she was a little bit embarrassed about it, but it felt like a real contact experience to me. And she was trying to communicate to me, I think, that she needed to, this was part of a process she was going through about letting go of that pride she had felt.
Yes. We'll get signals. My grandfather, he died at almost 100, I think. But if I'm in meditation, all of a sudden I'll smell Captain Black tobacco, which was his brand. And so people often will smell the smell of cookies before Grandma, who built me and baked cookies, comes in. Different things, but often there'll be some marker like that, which is real interesting. Yeah.
So would you say that the phases that your brother went through followed a sequence that would make sense to you as a clinical psychologist?
Yes. Clinical psychologist / emergency room physician for the energetic body.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
That's a nice way to put it.
And again, seeing the different types of styles of that treatment, if you will, described seem very logical from my clinical background. This is different than claiming as a clinical psychologist, you got to believe this. But it seemed compatible with very therapeutic kind of strategies, allowing things to take their own pacing. We talked last time about the grief of the person left having to take its own pacing. And so there seemed to be deep honor for that soul's experience, for their level of readiness to move from one stage to another, and pretty creative ways to help the person do that.
Well, Joseph Gallenberger, this has been a real pleasure and
mine as well,
and an enlightening experience. We're having the kind of conversation that is so taboo in so many circles that I think will be very helpful for many of our viewers.
Good. That's my hope.
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Thank you for being with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us. Thank you.